doing okay? You doing okay?
The learning materials for it, 5,200 pages.
Guys, ready?
Oh, sorry.
It's all right.
Mark's talking.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad to have this group to really dive into what the commentators say is one of the most interesting narratives of the Old Testament, this story of Naaman and his leprosy and his being cleansed. That's what we're going to get into tonight. Let's do a quick review of Lesson 8. This will be 2 Kings chapter 5. If you want to turn there, follow along, 2 Kings chapter 5. I think it's going to be familiar to you, so I'm going to move through and just kind of summarize the chapter and get right to the part where we make applications, because there are a lot of applications, a lot of different areas on this narrative that we could focus on and make applications. And this is the section of the kings of Judah and kings of Israel that we're dealing with. And remember, Jehoshaphat's reigning in Judah. Joram is reigning, and Ahaziah, I think, also for a bit of time, reigning in Israel. Notice just below Jehoshaphat on the left is Jehoram. So we've got Jehoram and Joram, and they're spelled differently, each of them sometimes, so it's really confusing. We've got kings with the same name in the two different places and at the same time. So it's really hard. And the other thing is, as we go through the narrative, it'll just drop the name in this section and say, well, then the king of Israel did this. And you go, now, okay, who is it again? I'm trying to remember. And so it's really a challenge to keep up with all these names. Recall, this is the graphic that's keeping track as we move through the time of the kings. 120 years for the first three kings and united Israel. And then we break north and south. We're following the folks through. We're right here at this start of the second slide as this is laid out. Down at the bottom, the time, about 850 BC. We've got 125 years or so until Israel gets taken over by the Assyrians and really is no more after that. So we're I don't know, almost halfway through the life of that northern kingdom that shall never did have a faithful king. Of course, after they fall to the Assyrians, we'll watch Judah stand alone for a number of years and finally go off after about 150 years to Babylonian captivity, and that's that. The chronology of the prophets, we're still right up at the very start of the time of the prophets. We're with Elijah and Elisha. And a review from Lesson 5. We're on Lesson 8 tonight, but Lesson 5, we set these different kings side by side, and we noticed the introduction of Elijah and Elisha. And I asked this question of you last time we were together, it was 2 weeks ago. Why these men? Why in the narrative of these kings are we now focused on these two prophets? Why spend so much time on these? We're spending more time, more text on Elijah and Elisha than we do on most of the kings in this divided kingdom. Why? Why are we doing this? So I want to remind you of that, and then when we get to the lesson tonight, we want to make sure we answer that question. Why are we spending so much time on these guys? All right, that brings us up to Naaman and his healing from leprosy. It's the 2 Kings chapter 5. And then the rest of the chapter is on his servant, or on Elisha's servant, Gehazi, and his greed and the way that plays out. So I really want to focus on the first part of this. And let me just take you through the narrative real quickly. I hope this is visible. Yeah, it's not too bad. But we've got these different characters in this narrative. We've got Naaman, the commander of the army of the king of Syria, a great man with his master and in high favor. So he's right up there in Syria. He's a great guy, but he's got a problem. He is a mighty man of valor, but he was a leper. And you know, for the Jews, being a leper meant you're outside the camp, you're unclean, all of that. I don't know that it was so segregating when you were in another culture back then. It seems like he's just operating in Syria, but we know he's got this problem. But there's a slave maiden who comes into the narrative. We go from very high functioning to the lowest level of society. The slave maiden shows up. They got the king of Syria and then the king of Israel. We've got the prophet Elisha, a servant of the prophet Elijah. Well, actually, a servant of Naaman, really, figures in here. I guess there is another servant of Elisha as well. And then this other servant, Gehazi. So let's go real quickly through the narrative and summarize it. Naaman served the king of Syria, but he had this problem. He ailed with leprosy. And of course, that was beyond anybody's cure back in that day. But this slave maiden, brought in as war spoils, winds up in Naaman's house and just shares, seemingly in an offhand way, that, man, if he was back in Samaria, he could be healed. There's a prophet there that could do that. It's amazing to me that in that being controlled as a slave, she went out of her way to share this information. It's a pretty nice thing to take, to serve your master even with the possibility of a healing. It seems above and beyond the service that was required of a slave. And so you just admire her spirit in sharing this. The king of Syria, when he hears this information, Naaman brings it to him, cares enough to say, well, go check it out, and we'll get this taken care of. And the way we'll do it, instead of sending him to the prophet, he sends him to the king to king. So the king, in a very formal way, with gifts and an entourage and a letter from the king of Syria, sends to the king of Israel. Now, when the king of Israel gets this, he totally misunderstood. Me? Cure leprosy? That's not going to happen. Who does he think I am? He's asked me to do the impossible, so he's probably picking a fight with me. And, oh man, now I've got a war coming because this guy's just getting weird with me. And he's afraid. Elisha hears of this. It's not that he was summoned by the king of Israel, but he hears what's going on. And he just said, don't worry about it. He didn't leave him just hanging there either. He said, have him come and see me. Send him to me. And so I guess the king of Israel is glad to have some way out of this. So he does. He sends Naaman on to see Elisha. And so when he does that, Naaman expected pomp and circumstance. The guy's going to come out. We're going to have a show. Going to do this thing in a very celebrated, fancy, regal way. That's how we do things in the court in Syria. And Elisha doesn't even go out to the guy, just says, dip 7 times in the Jordan, you'll be fine. And it is not at all what Naaman expected. And so he just rejects it. He's mad. He says, I thought the guy at least come out. He tells me to dip in this muddy little hole that is the Jordan River. We got a lot better rivers back home. I just can't believe it. And so he's rejecting this salvation. This is a cure of an incurable problem that's being offered to him. That's when his servant, one of his servants, says, Master, If he told you to do something big and terrible, you would have done it, right? Just go dip in the river. And so he says that, and I guess Naaman's got it out of his system. He cools off a little bit. He thinks about it. He settles down, and he goes and he does it. He does exactly what he was told. He dips 7 times in the Jordan River, and it says that he comes away with the skin of a child. He's been healed of his leprosy, and he's just restored, and it's an amazing thing. So he finally obeys, and he finally was healed. And that's when he comes back to Elisha, and he's just overwhelmed. And of course, he brought all this stuff with him in the entourage, in the caravan or whatever. And he says, let me give you some stuff, because we brought it to give you. You've done a great thing for me. Let me do something nice for you. And Elisha says, absolutely not. I'm not needing anything. I'm not taking anything. It wasn't about that. And so he tried to give, but he winds up taking. And you know what he took, right? He took 2 baskets of earth. Now, why in the world would he do that? Well, seemingly back in those days, they thought gods, whatever, the God of the place was connected to the soil of the place. And so if I get some of your soil, and we do this sometimes, I mean, we go to a place, we pick up something there, and we're kind of connected to it. But he's going to take this earth back home, and that's going to be his connection to the God who did this. And I love the place where he seeks pardon in advance, because as he takes his old king, you know, as his leader, as he guides him, as that king goes to worship a false god, when he gets back home, he knows he's going to have to do this. He's going to have to kneel down with the king in that temple, and it's going to look like he's worshiping that God, but he's not going to be. So he wanted to pardon in advance for that behavior that could be misconstrued. I just love how sensitive his conscience is there to that. So he takes the soil, and off he goes. And that should be the end of the story. But that's when Gehazi just cannot pass up the loot that was offered. And so he goes after the entourage as it's leaving with all the loot that it brought, and he makes up a story. A couple guys just came, changed their mind, we could use some stuff. And so would you give us? And so Naaman's just glad to give exactly what he asked for, and maybe a little bit more. Gehazi brings it back, stashes it away. Everything should be fine until he gets in the presence of Elisha, who asks, where have you been? And I didn't go anywhere. He said, did my heart not go with you when you were there? And this man, Elisha, of course, knows exactly what happened. And then the result, the response, I guess, the thing that had been taken away from Naaman by dipping obediently in the Jordan falls upon Gehazi and his family too, right? Or is it just Gehazi? And he becomes a leper. And now, you know, he sought to get gain from this. He got more, certainly he got more than he expected. All right, so much going on in there. What are your takeaways from this chapter 5?
Well, one of the things that the amount of silver was the amount of 750 pounds.
Yes.
A lot of silver, and the gold was 150 pounds. A lot of gold. And remember, we talked about every once in a while about the lies and deception throughout the Old Testament. Well, here's right here. Elijah asked him, "Where have you been?" He said, "I didn't go anywhere."
That wasn't the first lie he told.
No.
The first lie was, oh, we had a couple guys come, we changed our mind, we want some of that now. We want some of that, you know. So he starts lying, and he keeps lying. Yeah. Remember the rule that we said, just broad rule, looking back at the Old Testament and lying in the Old Testament? The rule of thumb, if you're lying to help God and his people, it's okay. in the Old Testament times. Now, if you're lying for yourself, just trying to get stuff, that's not going to fly. There's no way that's going to work.
Right at the beginning, it's kind of interesting in that we see I'm going to say we see the value of preaching, or we see the value of telling stories, or we see the value of spreading the gospel. And by that, what I mean is, here's this little girl who just makes a comment, right? Oh, well, it's too bad you're a leper. If we were back in Israel, my master would be able to heal you. And that finds its way to the king of Aram and the king of Israel. And, I haven't fully thought this through, but it just shows the power of, we never know when I'll use the word witness to somebody. Right?
Yes.
When we mention somebody about God, when we mention to somebody about church, when we mention somebody about faith, or tell a story from the Bible, we just never really know where it'll wind up, right? And we should be about that kind of work, because we never know where it's going to create something down the road. This little girl may not have ever known what happened here, in the full, but, here you see it. I just think it's interesting.
It is.
The power of taking the advantage to witness.
And if you were of a mind to excuse sharing the gospel because you're not in a position of power or influence so that the message could be heard, here's a counterexample.
Spread it.
For this woman,
Just spread it.
had none.
You
She's at the fringe of society.
You don't know who it'll wind up with. You don't know who will spread it after you. You don't know who will hear it at the end. But spread it.
It's a really great example of that. And caring enough. She couldn't have been obligated to do this. I mean, nobody else knew but she, that this healing was available. And so she cared, and she shared. And look what happened.
Just shows the power of words are very powerful no matter which way you go. And why Jesus says, or is it in Proverbs, the person who can control his tongue can hold, is the most powerful thing. So the
Yep.
words, whether it's spreading the gospel or a little comment, has such a huge effect.
Mhm.
Obviously, it's God who's using that to his advantage, but also there's also that flip side, words can also
Mhm.
powerfully destroy
Yeah.
very easily. So
Yeah.
learning how to use your words wisely is powerful. I used to believe years when I was young, naively, that you can convince anybody of anything, whether for good or evil. It's just a matter of what you would have to say that would affect them and convince them of that. I don't say believe that now. I'm not necessarily going to convince somebody who believes in God to be an atheist, but the idea of words extremely powerful.
There's something, lies spread fast, but time is pulling for the truth, I think. And the truth is going to run out of this. I've just got enough for one per couple for these maps, but I found these maps and I thought they were pretty good. When I was a teacher, I could hand these things out.
I think, Jeff, too, this story
And Gehazi wanted that too.
Because they wanted to see that, right? And very clearly, it's like, no, that would miss the message. The power is in God's power, not in the grandeur of things. And I just think that's really interesting as well.
Yeah.
You know, especially when I was first learning about the Church of Christ and studying, you know, I kind of had that attitude too. We worshiped in a very swell. We actually, the first time I ever went to a Church of Christ, we worshiped in a double wide trailer, you know? And so I thought, what is this little place? You know, this can't be real, right? Where's the great big beautiful building and
Yes.
whatnot? And it just reminds us that that's not the way God does his work. You know, that's just not the way. That's just interesting.
Well, take that idea though, and it's entirely correct and appropriate right here in this exchange between Naaman and the kings, and the way Elisha finally brings the healing through and about. But apply it also to all that we see with Elijah, and we're going to go see with Elisha. There's all sorts of pomp and circumstance and fancy stuff going on in societies at that time. And here are the most godly people, Elijah and Elisha, living very plain lives. And so that message is reinforced, I think, through many chapters of 1st and 2nd Kings. We'll come back to that as we're wrapping up.
Well, there are many austere churches of Christ. I mean, you know, because the way the church is established, you know, you don't have a central facility that gathers all the money and distributes it, you know. And so you have to start off with whatever you start off with.
That's right.
And most startups are in some public facility. You know, we started off in school, then we moved to a daycare, and we were in a daycare for several years, and I can still smell those dirty diapers every time, you know. And so we were there, and until we got the building built there.
Yeah.
And so
It's true.
you know, when you're having, you know, difficulty financial problem like that, you know, to build a building is a big deal. It's a big decision to make, and it takes a lot of money.
It does.
And
Especially in this area, it does, for sure. And this viewpoint, though, that Clint shared was coming from outside the church and seeing the lack of the grand and the glorious. You wonder a little bit about that, and you've got to dig. You've got to have the diligence. You've got to care enough to ask that question and get a good answer. Why are we here where there are dirty diapers? You know, why are we doing that?
It also shows God's power, of course, when he can do great things from the common. I mean, Naaman's point about, you know, there are far better rivers somewhere else.
Yes.
Well, that would put the power in the river, right? You know, if there was a river that was known to have healing qualities or something, and then, you know, he was healed, he'd say it was the river. But God takes something that apparently was dirty, common, you know, not a very impressive little stream, you know, maybe muddy and smelly and whatever.
Yeah.
You know, but God can do great things with the common.
Yeah. Good lessons here. There are lots more in this section. What else? Let me give you a list that I've got and then see if it gets you thinking of some others. The need that Naaman had to be healed of this problem is a crucial need, and there was nothing on earth at that time that was going to fulfill that need for him. And when he finds a solution, he latches onto it. This young, I don't know if she's young, but the servant girl, I think it says girl, caring enough to share and then gives that information. We see the misunderstanding and fear in the king, and you wonder how many folks just really don't understand it and can't get their head around it, and they just, you know, are afraid of going down the road of even getting the right answer. It doesn't seem like the king of Israel ever got connected to what was going on here. I love the expectations of Naaman, what I was expecting is not this solution. And it being so different from what he expected, he almost passed it up. But the wise counsel, and I am thankful every time I get into a situation where I'm going to use something from the next chapter, fly off the handle and react really poorly. And there's somebody in my life who says, hey, slow down. Think about this. As the servant said to Naaman, and brought him back on track and got him where he needed to go. Didn't do it from power, just did it from, and a lot of the folks in the Bible that provide that counsel aren't in a position of power. They just say the right thing at the right time. As it says in the Proverbs, the words of gold are like, apples of gold in fittings of silver, a word spoken at the right time. And then obedience, just doing the simple thing that you're told and being thankful when it works. Naaman is humble in his gratitude. And then the ugly part at the end, the greed. And, this whole wonderful story is tarnished somehow by Gehazi just so misunderstanding what he was about. And I think you can make a pretty good connection to the motives of Judas Iscariot. The salvation and the kingdom that Jesus was preaching was not the kingdom, I don't think, that he was expecting. He was expecting more money and more power. That's why he skims off the bank. And so he can't see that the kingdom is, how it's going to be, how it's supposed to be. He doesn't accept that and winds up betraying Jesus for money. So, this desire for money is the root of all kinds of evil. And here's an example of that. Okay, Clint.
The other one that I've done lessons on that I think is really powerful is as you look at, and you've got obedience there, full obedience, right? There's a good parallel here, when we talk about dipping 7 times in the River Jordan. He wasn't healed after the first time,
Not
or
after
the
the
second
first
time,
or second.
or the 5th, or the 6th, right? When the walls fell down in Jericho, they didn't fall, even though God said, I've given the city into your hands. They didn't fall when they marched the first day. They didn't fall when they marched the second day. And you can use a number of different examples in the Bible that show the value of completely obeying God. And then so when we move that to the idea of becoming a Christian, for us to say, well, we have to hear, believe, confess, repent, and be baptized. Well, why do I have to do all of them? I don't know. Because God said, why do I have to dip 7 times, right? If I dip once, that's not any better than, if I dip 3 times, that's not even better than 7. So I'm not going to do it, right? I'll do it twice. I'm not going to do it 7 times. People will start laughing at me. And you know what? If he'd have done it 3 times and said that should be good enough and come out, he wouldn't have been cleansed.
Be a wet leper.
He'd be a wet leper. If he did it 6 times and decided that's enough, right? This is ridiculous. He'd have been a wet leper.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to obey God completely.
Yeah.
And this is just one more of those examples. What was the difference between the 6th and 7th time? The difference between partial obedience and complete obedience. And that's it.
The difference between being afflicted with leprosy and being cured of leprosy. And so, just a great lesson there about simple, complete obedience. And not as though he didn't, when he dipped 7 times, he didn't earn being cleansed. He just responded and fulfilled the conditions that had been placed upon him, and then God did the healing. So, there you go. What else, dear ones? Anything else on that? All right, there's more to talk about here. As we go on, in 2 Kings chapter 6, the axe head is lost and recovered through a miraculous means. The chariots of fire that are viewed, this force that's trying to, the Syrian force that's trying to overcome Samaria and Israel is convinced that Elisha is the reason why they can't ever sneak up on him. So they go and in a just surprise surround Elisha and just a bunch of men of God. It's not, I think you'd look at them as just nerds. They're not by any means warriors, and they're surrounded by an army. And it's just amazing when the young fella says to Elisha, "What are we going to do?" And Elisha is not at all put out that he is surrounded by an army. And he doesn't pray for a solution. He prays that the one who is worried can see the solution that's already there. Those that are with us are far greater than those that are with them. And he prays, and that man can see, and he looks, and the hills are filled with chariots of fire, already surrounding the hostile force that is surrounding them. So we've got the prophets, we've got a ring of a hostile army, and we've got a ring of the army of the Lord all around them. They're already there. Well, this is another place also that the Lord, is going to be another in this section where the Lord uses confusion to bring about a victory. And I don't know, you guys probably have all at least heard of Star Wars if you haven't seen it. But one of the things the Jedi would do is just kind of move their hand and say, "These are not the droids you're looking for." And they would dismiss, and the weak of mind could be fooled by the power of their suggestion. Well, where do you think they got that? I think they got that exactly from here, where Elisha says, "Oh, well, I'll take you to him. Yeah, I know what you're looking for. I'll get you there." And he walks his whole army into the center of the camp of the Israelite army. And now they wake up surrounded themselves. And the king, who seems just to be a buffoon, says, "Shall I kill him? Shall I kill him?" And he says, "No, don't kill him. Just give him something to eat, and we'll send him home." And they do. And you know what? It says for the rest of the time, in the next generation or so, that army didn't come back. And it was an amazing solution to the problem. But Ben-Hadad, it said that, but Ben-Hadad does come back and besiege Samaria. And there's some awful things that happen in there as well. But food was promised to get the resolution. The siege had made it so all these food supplies were precious and expensive. But in 2 Kings chapter 7, he promises that it's going to be cheap food soon. And the way that it's discovered, again, it's confusion. The Syrian army had gotten confused, and they had thought that there was a threat to them coming, and they just bugged out. And it was some lepers who were desperate who went out and found it, and then another party went out and found it, and then they went to check and see what happened, and they just find a trail of loot where the army of the Syrians had been. And they just go out and get all that food and bring it in, and food's cheap the next day because of that. But God used confusion to bring victory to his people. They didn't have to fight at all. Well, then it goes on with Ahaziah, and we get back into the narrative, really, at that point in terms of just following the kings, back to that, succession of kings in Judah and in Israel. So that brings me back to this question with all this time that we're spending on Elijah and Elisha. Why? Why are we looking at all these miracles? And why are we spending so much time thinking about these guys? Mark.
So it seems like God has set Elijah up to be the epitome of the prophets. He seems to represent the prophets and the prophetic activities. And then your other question, why are these types of miracles important? When we look at the New Testament, oftentimes we look at the miracles that Jesus performed and that the disciples raise the dead. Well, he can raise us from the dead spiritually. Jesus can cure the leper. He can cure us of an incurable disease, which is sin. So we look at the New Testament and we say these miracles are important because of what they show. I think the same principle holds true for these miracles that Elijah and Elisha and the other prophets perform. It shows the power of God over incurable diseases like leprosy, over provision, over armies. It just shows the power of God. I think it just, through these prophets, God shows his power.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's the most important point, showing God's power, what he can do, and that is anything. He can do anything he wants. No matter what it is, he can do it. And that reading the Old Testament, learning these things, just makes you believe, makes a believer out of you.
Or it ought to. It sure ought
God said
to.
he can save you if you do this stuff that
Yeah.
I'm telling you to do, then it's going to happen.
What?
He's going to save you.
When Elijah pops on the scene without any introduction, as often is the case with the prophets, you don't know anything about them until they start their prophesying. What's the spiritual state of Israel and Judah? Israel especially. What's the spiritual state of them? The king has married a woman whose father was a priest of Baal. And they're worshiping Baal as well. That's where the king and the queen are. What about the people? Elisha says it himself. I don't think there's anybody faithful left. I don't think, I'm the only one that's left that's serving God. That's what Elijah said. Who's opposing him? The king, the queen. Groups of soldiers go out after Elijah. Jezebel comes after him eventually. Besides that, just all the circumstances that he finds himself in, trying to stay alive. How does God respond to that? God delivers him from everybody in every way that he needs. Whether it's being fed by birds or being protected from a group of soldiers that have come after him to take him and to seize him, or just hide him away. And you can also see on that map how many different places he went. It's amazing to see how the protection and the provision the Lord provides his godly servant, no matter who is opposing them. And then Elisha, the same way. Just a simple fellow. But there's an example here also of, what are we supposed to do? What did Paul say we were supposed to do with the things that have been committed to us? We're supposed to commit them to other faithful men who'll be able to teach others also. And Elijah does that, and he gets Elisha and raises him up, and Elisha goes on to do great things as well. And whether it's a small thing of getting an axe head back out of the water because it was borrowed, and we shouldn't be that way when we borrow stuff, we should bring it back, or whether it's an entire army that has surrounded him, God protects his people from the different things that can happen. And so their credibility, the credibility of a person who is following God, of Elijah and Elisha, rises to the point where I don't think anybody's respecting the king, but everybody respects them. And so just an amazing lesson to Israel and to the world about that old adage, you and the Lord are a majority. And it doesn't matter what everybody else is doing. You can stand alone and stand secure.
So thinking about that, one of the things that impresses me as you read through the Old Testament and these historical accounts is the way time after time after time, the lesson is honor God, serve God, obey God, and he'll take care of you. So the people of the other nations had their idols, their gods, so-called, and, they honored their so-called gods. What makes the difference? Well, I think this exemplifies the difference. You think about Elijah and the priests of Baal, that contest showed Baal is nothing. God is the creator of all things. God is powerful. Baal is nothing. And so you're going to either serve the dumb idols that have no power, or you're going to serve and obey God. And so it's exemplified through these miraculous acts that are performed through that contest and so many of these other things. It's God saying, look, I told you, there's no power in those other things, but I can help you. And yet, again and again and again and again, the northern kingdom, the kings refused to serve God. And so I think you see that exemplified. And then the other thing that's interesting, thinking about the servant girl, it was like the people recognized what was going on. The kings, it's like they're wearing blinders, but even the people recognize. Here's this girl who gets captured and carted off into Aram in Syria, and she even knows there's a prophet in Israel. I wish my master was there. So the people recognize what's going on, but the kings just refuse to consider it.
And probably not a majority of the people, but there's a remnant. There's a portion. There's 7,000, Elijah was told, that have not bowed the knee to Baal. They're out there. And don't ever think that you're alone. There's a group. Scott, would you ring the buzzer one time for us, please? The lasting effect or reputation of Elijah. He does not die. We see him taken up. At the close of the book of Malachi, it says Elijah's going to come again to announce the Messiah. And at the start of the Gospels, we see Elijah mentioned again. Paul mentions Elijah in Romans chapter 11. James mentions him in James chapter 5. Elijah has an amazing effect. Elijah stands with our Lord at the transfiguration with Moses. Recall? Recorded in Matthew chapter 17. Elijah and Moses, have both worked many miracles, have both led God's people, have both gone through parted waters and stood there with our Lord and Savior, who was going to, I guess, provide the greatest deliverance ever. So Elijah's lasting effect is amazing. And he really is just a wonderful person to consider. So, chapter 8, the Shunammite that we had seen earlier interacting with Elisha felt it necessary to go into the land of the Philistines because of a famine, comes back, petitions that her lands that she forfeited be restored, and when they say, oh, that's the Shunammite woman, they say, okay, the king gives her lands back. Ben-Hadad gets sick and sends somebody to Elisha to see if he's going to recover. And he sends Hazael to get the message, and it's eerie to read the narrative there. Elisha looks at Hazael for a while and just kind of stares at him. And he says, yeah, your master's going to recover, but he's not going to live. And then he just starts crying. He says, why are you crying? As he's looking at Hazael, he says, I know what you're going to do. I see what you're going to do to the people. And it's terrible. And Hazael goes back and tells Ben-Hadad he's going to recover, but then smothers him and goes on to do all those terrible things that Elijah has seen. So it's a really dark section there. And then we get back into the succession of kings, and Jehoram reigns in Judah, and Ahaziah, another Ahaziah, I think, reigns in Judah. So, yeah, that's what's happening at the end of chapter 8. So for a week from tonight, lesson 9, it's going to be, well, we already did chapter 8, but I guess it's chapters 9 and 10. Maybe we'll spend some more time on chapter 8 in 2 Kings. And then 2 Chronicles backs this up, chapters 21 and 22. So that's lesson 9 for a week from tonight. Okay, thanks for your attention. We'll go ahead and ring the bell one more time and get folks up here.